I never imagined I'd be standing in my driveway one morning, staring at my car filled with cement. But then again, I never imagined I'd ever cross paths with Deborah Wilson, the self-appointed queen of Sycamore Hills and president of our infamous HOA. If I'd known what was coming, maybe I would have thought twice before buying what I thought was my dream home. It started 3 months ago when I moved into a beautiful 2-story colonial tucked into a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was perfect, big windows, a spacious yard, and tree-lined streets that seemed to promise peace. My realtor casually mentioned the HOA, reassuring me they were reasonable. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag. Within 48 hours of moving in, I found a violation notice slapped on my front door like a scarlet letter. According to Deborah Wilson herself, the fence I'd freshly painted was the wrong shade of white, eggshell instead of pearl white, as mandated by the community guidelines. To my eyes, they looked identical, but apparently, the distinction mattered enough to threaten me with a $100 fine unless I repainted it within 72 hours. Still trying to be the good neighbor, I called the number listed on the notice. Deborah answered on the second ring. Her voice was as cold and clipped as a winter morning. "Ignorance of the rules isn't an excuse, Mr. Mitchell," she said curtly. "The bylaws were included in your closing documents. I suggest you review them immediately." Before I could get a word in, she hung up. I swallowed my frustration, bought the paint, and spent my weekend redoing the fence. It was easier and cheaper than fighting over technicality. I told myself it was a one-time misunderstanding, a bump in the road to settling in. But I was wrong. So wrong. Over the next few weeks, the notices kept coming. My lawn was apparently half an inch too tall. A garden hose, coiled neatly by the garage, was declared visible from the street. My trash can, wheeled out a few hours early one evening, earned me another fine. It was clear Deborah had made me her personal project. At first, I tried to reason with her. Every time I called, I was met with the same icy tone, the same rigid refusal to consider any human context or basic decency. It wasn't about the rules, it was about control. But what struck me most was the hypocrisy. Across the street, my neighbor had a basketball hoop set up in his driveway, strictly forbidden according to the HOA handbook I'd now practically memorized. Yet there were no violation notices taped to his door. It became obvious I wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA president. I was dealing with someone who had chosen me, specifically, as her enemy. And the worst was yet to come. One evening, after another long day at work, I pulled into my driveway just as Deborah came power walking down the sidewalk in her trademark pastel tracksuit, clipboard in hand like some self-appointed sheriff. Her eyes locked onto me with laser precision. She marched right up as I stepped out of my car, the tension between us almost crackling in the evening air. "Good evening, Deborah," I said, forcing a polite smile. "Is there something I can help you with?" She tapped her pen aggressively against the clipboard. "Your vehicle is in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4, she announced sharply. "No vehicles may be parked in driveways for more than 30 minutes unless they are in pristine condition. Your car has mud on the wheel wells." I blinked at her, genuinely at a loss for words. I'd driven through a light rain that morning. Yes, there was a little dried mud, but nothing outrageous, nothing that any reasonable person would even notice, let alone care about. "I just got home from work," I said as calmly as I could. "I'll wash it this weekend. I don't think a little mud is worth a fine." Her lips tightened into a thin line, her face reddening. "I decide what qualifies as a violation, Mr. Mitchell. And frankly, I've noticed you have a consistent problem with respecting authority." I could feel my patience slipping. I was exhausted, frustrated, and, honestly, a little amused at the absurdity of it all. Without thinking, I let out a small chuckle. Not mocking, just disbelief. But Deborah saw it differently. Her eyes widened with fury, and she gripped her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You won't be laughing when you receive your next fine," she hissed, then turned sharply on her heel and stormed off down the sidewalk. I watched her go, unsettled. Something told me I hadn't just annoyed her. I'd crossed an invisible line, one that she had drawn in her mind long ago. And crossing that line, I would soon learn, came with consequences. The next morning, everything spiraled. I had an important meeting lined up, a chance to pitch a big contract that could define the next few years of my career. Dressed in my best suit, briefcase in hand, I stepped outside and froze. My car was gone, or so it seemed at first. In its place was a large, awkward shape covered by a blue tarp. Heart hammering, I sprinted down the driveway and yanked the tarp away. Beneath it was my sedan, but the entire interior was destroyed, filled to the brim with hardened gray cement. Seats, dashboard, steering wheel, everything solidified into a grotesque sculpture. I stood there, staring at the wreckage, my mind blank with shock. Was this some sick prank? A mistake? But deep down, I already knew. Only one person could have been behind something this vindictive. Deborah Wilson. My hands trembling, I pulled out my phone and called 911. As I waited for the police to arrive, my eyes caught a glint from across the street. John's security camera, mounted high on his garage, pointed directly at my driveway. Maybe, just maybe, we had her caught. The police arrived faster than I expected. 2 patrol cars pulling up with lights flashing against the early morning gloom. I waved them down, still rattled, still trying to wrap my mind around the sight of my ruined car. One of the officers, a tall guy with a graying mustache, whistled low when he saw the damage. "I've seen a lot of HOA disputes," he said grimly, "but nothing like this." I explained what had happened, or at least what I suspected had happened, and pointed out John's security camera across the street. The officers exchanged a look, then nodded. "Let's see if we can get a copy of that footage," one of them said. John was more than willing to help. In fact, he seemed almost relieved when we knocked on his door. "About time someone did something about her," he muttered, pulling up the security feed on his laptop. We gathered around the screen. The footage was clear, even in the darkness of the early morning, and what it showed made my stomach turn. There, at exactly 3:02 a.m., Deborah Wilson appeared on the screen, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest like some twisted badge of honor. With her was a man in work overalls, carrying buckets. They approached my car with a deliberate, practiced ease. Deborah kept watch while the man used a Slim Jim to pop the lock. Then, without hesitation, they started pouring bucket after bucket of wet cement into my car, filling it like it was just another hole to patch on a construction site. It was surreal. Watching it play out on screen, I felt detached, like I was witnessing someone else's nightmare. The officers took one look at me and said, "Do you want to press charges?" I didn't even hesitate. Absolutely. From there, everything moved quickly. One of the officers called for a warrant while the others documented the scene, snapping photos of the car, the hardened cement, the handprints left smeared along the frame. Within an hour, they were heading over to Deborah's house to place her under arrest. I stood outside, heart pounding, as police cars rolled up to her immaculate ranch-style home. The morning sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. Deborah answered the door, still wearing her bathrobe and slippers, her hair a frizzy mess. When she saw the officers, and then me, standing across the street, her face twisted into a look of pure rage. "This is all your fault," she screamed, pointing at me with a trembling hand. "You never respected the rules. You never showed the proper respect." The neighbors started to gather, peeking from behind curtains and half-open doors. The whole street, usually so quiet, buzzed with whispers and gasps. The officers handcuffed Deborah right there on her pristine front porch. She thrashed and protested, but they were calm, professional. They guided her into the back of the police car, as if they'd done it 100 times before. I watched in stunned silence. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry, either. I just felt bewildered. That anyone could spiral so far over something so petty that they'd risk everything just to punish someone for a speck of mud on a car. But if I thought that was the end of it, I was wrong. It was only the beginning. The next few weeks blurred into a haze of police interviews, insurance paperwork, and endless phone calls with attorneys. I spent hours recounting the details, handing over the security footage, documenting every fine and citation Deborah had ever issued me. It was exhausting, but I stayed with it, because this time, someone had to hold her accountable. The damage to my car was deemed a total loss. $22,000 gone. The cement hadn't just filled the interior. It had seeped into the engine, the wiring, every vital component. It was beyond salvage. Insurance helped, But they couldn't fix the sense of violation, the gnawing feeling that someone I'd once tried to reason with had decided to utterly destroy my property over a bruised ego. Meanwhile, word of what had happened spread through Sycamore Hills like wildfire. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down started coming forward. Quiet conversations on front lawns, whispered confessions over backyard fences. Everyone had a Deborah story. Petty violations. Arbitrary fines. Threats delivered with a smile. But no one had ever stood up to her before. Until now. Then, something unexpected happened. The man who had helped Deborah, the contractor caught on camera pouring cement into my car, decided to cooperate with the authorities. His name was Frank Morales. He wasn't a criminal by nature, just a guy who'd been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Frank came clean, telling investigators that Deborah had pressured him into helping her. According to his statement, she had threatened to report supposed building code violations on a kitchen remodel he had done for her unless he helped her teach me a lesson. It wasn't just coercion. It was blackmail. Frank's cooperation made the case against Deborah airtight. Now the charges weren't just vandalism and property destruction. They included conspiracy, coercion, and criminal mischief. When the trial date finally came, I showed up early, dressed in a simple suit, trying to brace myself for whatever spectacle would unfold. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, reporters, even people from other neighborhoods had shown up, eager to see how it would all end. Deborah sat at the defense table, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Gone was the brash, clipboard-wielding tyrant who patrolled our streets like a queen defending her kingdom. Now she just looked tired, angry, confused. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, she didn't even flinch. Maybe she still believed she was right. Maybe she thought the rules she enforced so mercilessly would somehow protect her. But the judge made it very clear they would not. Mistress Wilson, the judge said, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. Your role as HOA president was to serve your community, not terrorize it. You used your position to target, intimidate, and harm your neighbors for personal satisfaction. This court finds your actions reprehensible. He sentenced her to 6 months in county jail, 2 years of probation, and full financial restitution for the damage she caused. And then, the final blow, she was permanently barred from ever serving on any HOA board again. When the sentence was read, I caught a glimpse of her face, and for the first time, I saw something beyond the anger. I saw confusion, as if she truly, deeply didn't understand how her own obsession with control had led her here. But it had, and there was no undoing it now. The gavel struck with a sharp crack, echoing through the courtroom like a final seal on everything that had happened. I watched as the bailiff led Deborah away, her hands cuffed in front of her, her shoulders slumped. Her bathrobe and slippers were long gone. Today she wore a plain gray suit, but she seemed smaller somehow, deflated, like a balloon finally punctured after years of swelling with unchecked power. As she disappeared through the heavy wooden door, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, heavier, grief, maybe not for her, but for the entire situation. For the community she had divided. For the damage that went deeper than cement in a car or fines on a fence. Sycamore Hills would never be the same, and neither would I. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly began to heal. The new interim HOA board, hastily assembled after Deborah's conviction, dropped half the ridiculous restrictions she'd enforced. The basketball hoop across the street stayed up. The neighbor with the garden gnomes on their lawn, they added a few more, just for good measure. There was laughter again. There were block parties, shared cups of coffee, actual conversations instead of nervous waves from a distance. People were cautious at first, like animals emerging from a long winter. But the fear that had hovered over Sycamore Hills was gone, replaced with something rare in suburban life. Community. As for me, I got a new car eventually. It wasn't about the car, though. It never had been. It was about standing up when it would have been easier to stay silent. About refusing to let someone's petty tyranny define how I live my life. One evening, a few months after everything had settled, I stood on my front porch with a beer in hand, watching the sun set behind the trees. John wandered over, hands in his pockets. "You did a good thing," he said quietly. I shrugged. All I did was get my car destroyed. He chuckled. Yeah, but you also gave us our neighborhood back. I smiled, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. Because deep down, I knew it shouldn't have had to come to that. Respect, community, basic decency. They shouldn't have to be fought for like this. But sometimes they do. And when they do, you have to stand your ground, no matter how absurd, petty, or exhausting the battle may seem. Because if you don't, the Deborahs of the world win. And we can't afford to let them. Not ever again.